Breathe in the heavy, intoxicating scent of crude oil, expensive cigars, and absolute unapologetic success that hangs thick in the warm spring air of Tulsa, Oklahoma in the year 1921. You are walking down Greenwood Avenue, the beating, vibrant heart of a 35-square-block neighborhood that is widely known across the entire United States as Black Wall Street, and you are bearing witness to the greatest concentration of black wealth and economic independence that the American continent has ever seen. This is not a struggling community scraping by on the margins of a hostile society. This is a completely self-sustaining economic empire. Imagine walking past the majestic Stratford Hotel, a massive 54-room luxury brick establishment featuring indoor plumbing, luxury dining, and a massive casino that rivals anything the white establishment has built across town. You hear the syncopated rhythms of jazz pouring out of the Dreamland Theater. You see black doctors, surgeons, and brilliant lawyers operating out of pristine brick office buildings, and you watch black oilmen driving incredibly expensive Pierce Arrow automobiles down paved streets, while many of their white neighbors are still riding in horse-drawn wagons on dirt roads. The dollar in Greenwood does not just circulate once it bounces from the black grocer to the black banker to the black mechanic, circulating within the community dozens of times before it ever leaves, effectively building a financial fortress that shields the residents from the suffocating daily humiliations of Jim Crow. This incredible prosperity was built by visionaries like O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford, men who bought up tracts of land explicitly to sell exclusively to other black citizens, creating a safe haven, a promised land, right in the middle of the unforgiving Midwestern plains. But in the deeply segregated, deeply racist reality of early 20th century America, black economic independence is the ultimate unforgivable sin. Just across the Frisco Railroad tracks, which serve as the rigid physical and psychological border between the two entirely different worlds of Tulsa, sits a massive growing population of white working-class laborers, many of whom are struggling to survive in the volatile boom and bust cycle of the oil industry. They look across those tracks, they see the brick mansions and the tailored suits of Greenwood, and their economic anxiety rapidly metastasizes into a deep, venomous, and incredibly dangerous racial envy. They cannot process the reality that the people they have been taught their entire lives to view as biologically inferior are vastly outperforming them in the capitalist system. This simmering toxic resentment becomes a massive invisible powder keg sitting directly beneath the prosperous streets of Greenwood, just waiting for the slightest excuse, the tiniest spark to detonate and completely vaporize everything these incredibly hard-working people have built. But before we cross the railroad tracks into the dark, terrifying heart of the conspiracy that is about to unfold, I need you to stand up and be counted. So drop your city in the comments right now to map out our global battalion, because the only way we fight back against the deliberate century-long erasure of this history is by building an army of people across the world who refuse to let these ghosts fade into the darkness. The spark that the white supremacist establishment is desperately waiting for arrives on the morning of May 30th, 1921, inside the Drexel Building, located in the heavily segregated white commercial district of downtown Tulsa. Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black man who shines shoes for a living, steps into the building's elevator to use the segregated restroom located on the top floor. The elevator operator is a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. Exactly what happens in the few incredibly brief seconds that the elevator doors are closed will never be known with absolute historical certainty, but the most widely accepted and logical conclusion is that the elevator car's floor did not align properly with the building floor. Rowland tripped as he stepped inside, and his hand instinctively reached out to catch his balance, accidentally brushing against Sarah Page's arm or shoulder. Startled by the sudden contact, she lets out a scream, and Rowland, terrified of exactly what a white crowd will do to a black man accused of assaulting a white woman in 1921, immediately runs from the building. The incident is entirely accidental. There is absolutely no physical assault, no attempted crime, and in fact, Sarah Page herself would later refuse to press any charges against the young man. But the facts of the incident are completely irrelevant to a society that is desperately starving for a reason to unleash hell. The local police quickly track Rowland down and arrest him, placing him in a holding cell on the top floor of the Tulsa County Courthouse. If the situation had simply been left to the actual authorities, the tragic misunderstanding might have blown over. But Tulsa is home to a newspaper called the Tulsa Tribune, edited by a deeply racist man named Richard Lloyd Jones, who sees this minor incident as the perfect, absolute, ultimate weapon to destroy the black community. The next afternoon, the Tribune publishes a completely fabricated, sensationalized, and violently inflammatory front-page article with the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator," falsely claiming that Rowland brutally assaulted and scratched the young woman. But the truly catastrophic, highly calculated move by the Tribune is a rumored editorial strategically placed on the exact same page, explicitly stating that a white lynch mob is planning to hang Rowland that very night, effectively serving as a printed public invitation for every white supremacist in the county to grab their rifles and march on the courthouse. The psychological impact of this newspaper article is immediate and devastating. By sunset, a massive, heavily armed mob of angry white men begins to gather on the courthouse lawn, their numbers rapidly swelling into the hundreds, drinking heavily, waving revolvers in the air, and screaming for the local sheriff to hand over the keys to Rowland's cell so they can execute him in the street. Inside the jail, Sheriff Willard McCullough, who is vastly outnumbered, orders his deputies to barricade the doors, disable the elevators, and position themselves at the top of the stairs with their rifles drawn, preparing for an inevitable siege. The terrifying roar of the lynch mob echoes across the city, and the chilling sound carries all the way across the Frisco Railroad tracks directly into the heart of Greenwood. The black citizens of Tulsa hear the mob gathering, and they instantly recognize the terrifying, familiar pattern of American racial violence. But Greenwood in 1921 is not a community that will simply cower in the dark and wait to be slaughtered. This community is filled with hundreds of proud, battle-hardened black veterans who have just returned from the brutal, horrifying trenches of the First World War. These men had worn the uniform of the United States military, they had fired machine guns against the German army, they had bled for the promise of global democracy, and they had returned to an incredibly violent, incredibly hostile nation during the Red Summer of 1919, witnessing dozens of horrific lynchings across the country. They had made a quiet, ironclad pact with one another that they would absolutely never allow another black man to be lynched in their city without a fight. In the bustling offices and the quiet living rooms of Greenwood, the veterans quickly mobilize. They put on their old military uniforms. They gather their high-powered Army surplus rifles. They fill their pockets with ammunition, and they make the incredibly brave, incredibly dangerous decision to march directly into the heart of the white mob. A group of about 50 heavily armed black men pile into cars and drive across the tracks, pulling up directly in front of the Tulsa County Courthouse. They step out of their vehicles holding their rifles at the ready and march in strict military formation, cutting a path directly through the shocked and furious white mob, standing face to face with the men who want to murder Dick Rowland. The black leaders approach the sheriff and explicitly legally offer their armed services to help the police protect the jail from the vigilantes. The sheriff, completely overwhelmed by the explosive tension of the situation, declines their offer, assuring them that his deputies have the situation under control, and urging the black men to return to Greenwood before the entire city goes up in flames. The veterans, having made their powerful statement of deterrence, agree to leave, piling back into their cars and driving back across the tracks. But their brave show of force absolutely, completely shatters the fragile ego of the white mob. The white vigilantes cannot fathom the reality that black men have the audacity, the absolute unapologetic courage to stand up to them with loaded weapons. The white crowd immediately explodes in size, growing from hundreds to over 2,000 men rapidly looting the local hardware stores, smashing the display windows of sporting goods shops, and stealing every single rifle, shotgun, and box of ammunition they can carry. The local police, instead of arresting the looters, actually begin actively deputizing the white mob, pinning official silver badges onto the chests of Ku Klux Klan members and explicitly instructing them to, quote, get a gun and get a nigger, completely legally validating the mass murder that is about to take place. The situation at the courthouse reaches an absolute fever pitch by 10 o'clock that night. The rumor spreads through Greenwood that the mob is finally storming the jail, and a second larger group of about 75 armed black veterans rushes back to the courthouse to make a final desperate stand to save Dick Rowland's life. When they arrive, the tension in the air is thick enough to choke on. Two massive, heavily armed groups of men are standing face to face on the dark streets of downtown Tulsa, separated only by a few feet of pavement and centuries of simmering racial hatred. The black men hold their ground, their rifles resting across their chests, completely refusing to be intimidated by the thousands of screaming white men surrounding them. And then a single, incredibly arrogant white man steps out from the mob and approaches a tall black World War I veteran. The white man demands that the veteran surrender his weapon. The black soldier looks the man dead in the eye and calmly, absolutely fearlessly replies, "I will not." The white man lunges forward, violently grabbing the barrel of the veteran's rifle, trying to physically wrestle the weapon away from him. In the terrifying, chaotic struggle for the gun, a finger slips, the trigger is pulled, and the deafening, catastrophic crack of a single gunshot shatters the humid night air, instantly igniting the most destructive, horrific, and entirely suppressed racial massacre in the history of the United States, as the absolute complete destruction of Black Wall Street officially begins. The single gunshot that echoed through the humid night air of downtown Tulsa was not just the sound of a trigger being pulled, it was the violent, catastrophic snapping of the incredibly fragile racial détente that had kept the city from tearing itself apart. And in the absolute fraction of a second after that first sharp crack, the entire street completely erupted into a blinding, chaotic, deafening crossfire. The black veterans, vastly outnumbered by thousands of furious white men, immediately realized that they were standing in a fatal funnel, completely exposed on all sides, and they executed a highly disciplined, tactical fighting retreat, falling back street by street, alley by alley, laying down suppressive fire to keep the surging white mob from completely overrunning them. They moved with absolute military precision, utilizing the combat skills they had learned in the muddy, blood-soaked trenches of France, communicating over the deafening roar of the continuous gunfire and making their desperate way back toward the Frisco railroad tracks, back toward the boundary of Greenwood to set up a defensive perimeter to protect their families. But the white mob left behind in the downtown commercial district did not disperse. They mutated. The initial shock of the gunfire rapidly transformed into a state of absolute homicidal frenzy, fueled by alcohol, deeply ingrained racial hatred, and a sudden terrifying realization of their own unchecked, unpunished power. The local authorities, the very men sworn to protect and serve, instead of attempting to restore order or disarm the rioters, completely surrendered the entire city to the mob. Police officers actively handed out official badges to men who were actively looting hardware stores, deputizing thousands of white supremacists on the spot and instructing them to go home, grab their personal firearms, and prepare for a massive, coordinated invasion of the Black District, explicitly authorizing them to murder American citizens. Men broke the heavy glass windows of sporting goods stores, pawn shops, and state armories, stealing thousands of high-powered hunting rifles, shotguns, crates of heavy ammunition, and most terrifyingly, several heavy military-grade machine guns, dragging the weapons out into the street and distributing them to anyone with a white face. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the physical border between white Tulsa and black Wall Street was completely illuminated by the bright orange muzzle flashes of continuous, intense skirmishes. The black defenders had frantically set up snipers in the tall brick buildings and the belfries of their beautifully constructed churches, including the newly built Mount Zion Baptist Church, creating a formidable, incredibly brave defensive line that effectively kept the white vigilantes from crossing the tracks in the dark. But the white mob was not planning a disorganized night raid. They were methodically, patiently preparing for a massive, overwhelming dawn assault. They commandeered local trains, setting up heavy machine gun nests on the flatbed cars, pointing the heavy iron barrels directly into the residential neighborhoods of Greenwood, waiting for the sun to rise. As the long, terrifying, agonizing night dragged on, families inside Greenwood huddled in their dark basements, clutching their crying children, praying in the dark, burying their jewelry and their hard-earned cash in their backyards, listening to the relentless, terrifying crack of rifles and the mechanical stutter of the machine guns tearing through the wooden walls of the businesses on the border. When the sun finally began to rise on the morning of June 1st, 1921, casting a pale, terrifying light over the tense, exhausted city, the heavy silence was suddenly shattered by the shrill, piercing mechanical scream of a local factory whistle. That whistle was the highly coordinated, pre-planned signal for the invasion to begin. Over 10,000 heavily armed white men, a completely deputized civilian army, poured across the Frisco Railroad tracks like a devastating, unstoppable tidal wave of iron and fire. The black defenders fighting desperately house to house, alley to alley, pouring fire from their windows, simply could not hold back the sheer, overwhelming numerical superiority of a mob that outnumbered them 10-1. The white vigilantes did not just want to arrest anyone, they did not just want to find Dick Rowland. They wanted to completely, permanently erase the absolute existence of black wealth from the face of the earth. They moved systematically down the beautifully paved streets of Greenwood, kicking down the heavy mahogany doors of the immaculate brick homes, the luxury hotels, and the thriving businesses. They looted absolutely everything of value, acting out of a deeply sick economic envy, stealing jewelry, cash, expensive clothing, heirloom silver, and even dragging grand pianos out onto the lawns, dragging the stolen wealth out into the streets before dousing the beautiful structures in heavy kerosene and throwing burning torches through the shattered windows. But the absolute most horrific, unprecedented, and terrifying aspect of the Tulsa Race Massacre did not come from the men marching on the ground. It came from the sky. As the black citizens of Greenwood fled from their burning homes, dodging the heavy machine gun fire sweeping down the avenues, cutting people in half, they heard a terrifying, unfamiliar mechanical drone approaching from above. They looked up into the smoke-filled sky and saw a squadron of private airplanes circling directly over their neighborhood. The wealthy white elite of Tulsa had mobilized their personal aircraft, effectively creating a private air force to conduct a highly coordinated military bombing campaign against American citizens on American soil. The men leaning out of the open cockpits of these biplanes began dropping improvised incendiary bombs, highly combustible glass bottles filled with turpentine, nitroglycerin, and burning rags directly onto the wooden roofs of the black-owned homes and businesses. The firebombs shattered on impact, instantly igniting the wooden shingles and sending massive columns of thick black smoke billowing into the bright morning sky. The sheer absolute terror of being hunted by heavily armed mobs on the ground, while simultaneously being bombed from the air by your own neighbors, is an unimaginable level of psychological and physical horror that completely paralyzed the defenseless population. The massive, beautiful Stratford Hotel, the absolute pride and joy of the black community, a symbol of everything they had built, was completely consumed by the flames. Its sturdy brick walls glowing bright orange in the inferno before collapsing into a massive pile of smoking, ruined rubble. The Dreamland Theater, the bustling, vibrant heart of Greenwood's cultural life, was burned entirely to the ground, the intense heat melting the projector and turning the seats to white ash. The Mount Zion Baptist Church, which had just been completed at a massive financial cost to the community and had served as a crucial, incredibly brave defensive stronghold during the night, was targeted by the heavy machine guns and completely obliterated by the incendiary bombs, its beautiful stained glass windows shattering outward in a blinding, devastating shower of fire and glass. The local fire department, finally arriving on the scene with their horse-drawn pump wagons, were immediately met by armed white men who aimed their rifles directly at the firefighters' heads, completely forbidding them from connecting their hoses to the fire hydrants, explicitly ordering them at gunpoint to let the entire Black Wall Street burn completely to ash. Families running for their lives were shot down in the streets like animals, their bodies left bleeding in the gutters, while the white looters literally stepped over their corpses to steal their belongings. Some residents managed to completely escape the burning city, fleeing blindly into the surrounding countryside, hiding in the tall grass of the Osage Hills, watching from a distance as their entire world, their entire economic future, their entire generational legacy was completely incinerated in a massive firestorm. Others were captured by the white mob, hands raised in desperate surrender, and were forced to march at gunpoint with their hands behind their heads through their own burning streets toward makeshift internment camps set up at the local fairgrounds and the baseball stadium. These completely innocent American citizens, having just lost absolutely everything they owned, their homes, their businesses, their life savings, were herded like cattle into incredibly overcrowded, unsanitary holding pens, completely stripped of their dignity, their freedom, and their constitutional rights. Heavily guarded by the exact same deputized white men who had just burned their homes to the ground. By the time the Oklahoma National Guard finally arrived and the governor officially declared martial law, bringing the active shooting to a halt, the physical devastation of Greenwood was absolutely apocalyptic. 35 square blocks of the wealthiest, most prosperous, incredibly successful Black community in the United States had been completely methodically reduced to a smoldering, desolate wasteland of blackened bricks, twisted iron, and smoking ash. Over 1,200 homes had been completely destroyed alongside dozens of churches, schools, grocery stores, hospitals, libraries, and businesses. The immense generational wealth that had been painstakingly built over decades of incredibly hard work, sacrifice, and brilliant entrepreneurship was completely, permanently wiped out in a single horrifying, incredibly violent afternoon. The official death toll reported by the white authorities was a completely fabricated, insultingly low number, claiming that perhaps 36 people had died. But eyewitness accounts, the horrific, immense scale of the destruction, and modern historical investigations point to a reality that is infinitely more devastating, suggesting that as many as 300 Black citizens were massacred during the invasion. Bodies were reportedly thrown off the bridges into the dark waters of the Arkansas River. They were tossed into the roaring flames of their own burning homes to completely incinerate the evidence, and they were dumped by the truckload into unmarked mass graves, hastily dug in the local cemeteries, the locations of which the city of Tulsa would desperately, intentionally try to completely hide and pave over for nearly a century. The absolute sheer scale of the carnage, the highly coordinated military tactics, the completely unprecedented use of airplanes to bomb a civilian population, and the complete total complicity of the local and state government makes the Tulsa Race Massacre one of the most horrific, devastating acts of domestic terrorism in the entire history of the world, and the absolute darkest, bloodiest chapter of the American experience that the architects of the system have spent 100 years trying to make you forget. The physical destruction of the Perry estate and the ensuing slaughter in the streets of Ocoee was an absolute apocalyptic nightmare. but it was only the first phase of a highly organized, state-sanctioned campaign to completely eradicate black economic and political power in Orange County. The white vigilantes, their thirst for blood temporarily satisfied by the lynching of July Perry and the massacre of dozens of innocent citizens, now turned their attention to the long-term, strategic goal of permanent ethnic cleansing. They did not just want to punish the black community for daring to vote, they wanted to ensure that a prosperous, independent black settlement like Ocoee could never rise from the ashes again. The morning after the massacre, a suffocating, terrifying silence hung over the smoldering ruins of the northern black settlement. The air was thick with the stench of burned wood and incinerated flesh. The surviving black residents, those who had managed to hide in the swamps or flee to neighboring towns, faced a horrifying reality. They had lost absolutely everything they owned, and returning home meant certain death. The white mob, now operating with the full, explicit support of the local authorities and the Ku Klux Klan, began a systematic campaign of intimidation and forced expulsion. They posted armed guards at the borders of the town, explicitly forbidding any black citizen from returning to claim their property or bury their dead. They rode through the surrounding countryside, threatening the few remaining black families who lived on the outskirts of Ocoee, demanding that they pack whatever they could carry and leave the county immediately or face the exact same fate as July Perry. The message was unmistakable. Ocoee was now a sundown town, an all-white municipality where the very presence of a black person was considered a capital offense. This campaign of forced removal was shockingly effective. Prior to the massacre, the black population of Ocoee was roughly 500 people, a thriving, vibrant community. Within weeks of the violence, that population was reduced to 0. The ethnic cleansing was complete. The economic devastation inflicted upon the black community was absolute and total. The survivors, suddenly rendered homeless and destitute, were forced to start their lives over from scratch in completely unfamiliar, often hostile environments. They had to abandon their businesses, their savings, and, most devastatingly, their incredibly valuable land. And this is where the true, calculated, incredibly cynical motive behind the massacre becomes sickeningly clear. The white elite of Orange County did not just want to stop the black vote. They wanted to steal the black wealth. In the months and years following the expulsion, the sprawling, highly profitable citrus groves and the valuable real estate owned by July Perry, Mose Norman, and dozens of other black families were systematically seized, auctioned off for pennies on the dollar, or simply stolen outright by the very same white men who had participated in the mob. The massive transfer of wealth that occurred in the wake of the massacre was one of the most egregious, entirely unpunished acts of state-sanctioned theft in American history. The white families who acquired this stolen land built massive fortunes, passing that stolen generational wealth down to their children and grandchildren, completely insulated from any legal or moral accountability. The local authorities, the state government of Florida, and the federal government in Washington did absolutely nothing to intervene, investigate, or provide restitution to the victims. Not a single white person was ever charged, arrested, or prosecuted for the murders, the arson, or the massive theft of property. The Ku Klux Klan and the white supremacist establishment had successfully executed a blueprint for absolute terror, and the state had officially endorsed it through its deafening, complicit silence. But the violence of Ocoee did not end with the theft of the land. It continued in the form of a massive, incredibly successful campaign of historical erasure. The white perpetrators, knowing that their actions were abhorrent even by the standards of the time, immediately went to work scrubbing the massacre from the official historical record. They controlled the local newspapers, the school boards, and the historical societies, and they actively suppressed any mention of the event for nearly 80 years. Generations of children, both white and black, grew up in Orange County completely unaware that the ground they walked on was soaked in the blood of innocent citizens. The town of Ocoee officially rebranded itself as the Center of Good Living, a sickeningly ironic slogan for a municipality built on mass murder and ethnic cleansing. The story of July Perry and Mose Norman was relegated to whispered rumors within the black community, a terrifying ghost story passed down in secret, while the white establishment completely denied the event ever happened. This deliberate, century-long silence is not just an omission of facts. It is a profound, continuing act of violence against the victims and their descendants. It is an active effort to deny the reality of systemic racism, to protect the stolen wealth of the perpetrators, and to prevent the nation from grappling with the horrifying truth of its own history. The erasure of the Ocoee Massacre is a chilling reminder that the victors do not just write the history books. They actively delete the chapters that expose their own monstrous behavior. This is the exact reason why the work we are doing right now, speaking these truths, sharing these stories, and demanding accountability, is so incredibly vital. We are not just recounting a tragedy from a century ago. We are actively fighting against a system that relies on historical amnesia to maintain its power today. The algorithm that controls the modern flow of information is deeply invested in keeping these stories buried, keeping you distracted, and keeping the truth fragmented and easily dismissed. It wants you to scroll past the uncomfortable reality of Ocoee and focus on meaningless, algorithmic noise. But we refuse to be complicit in the silence. The blood of July Perry and the innocent citizens of Ocoee demands to be remembered, not just as victims, but as incredibly brave martyrs for American democracy. Their sacrifice is a stark, terrifying reminder of the absolute fragility of our rights and the absolute necessity of relentless, uncompromising vigilance. We must take their story and use it as a weapon against the forces of ignorance and erasure. You have a profound responsibility to carry this history forward, to force the algorithm to acknowledge it, and to ensure that the silence that covered Ocoee for a century is finally, permanently shattered. Share this story, speak their names, and prove that you are part of an unbreakable, global movement that refuses to let the true history of the people be erased. Stand with us, claim your place in the fight for truth, and show the world that we are watching by dropping your city and your country in the comments below, mapping out our global battalion, and ensuring that the legacy of those who died demanding their rights is never, ever forgotten.